The call came at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, right in the middle of my quarterly review with Henderson from corporate. I watched the name First National Bank flash across my phone screen and felt my stomach drop like I'd just driven over a cliff. Banks don't call you at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday unless something's gone spectacularly wrong. Mr. Richardson, this is Janet Morales from First National. I'm calling regarding some unusual activity on your credit report that we need to discuss immediately. I stepped out of Henderson's office, holding up one finger in that universal just-a-minute gesture that every middle manager in America has perfected. 23 years at Hartwell Manufacturing, and I'd never walked out of a meeting with corporate. But the tone in Janet's voice suggested this wasn't the kind of call you take sitting down. What kind of unusual activity? Sir, it appears someone has used your credit profile to secure a mortgage for $340,000 on a property in Riverside County. The loan was approved yesterday, and the closing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. The hallway started spinning. I gripped the wall, my palm leaving a sweaty print on the beige paint that some facilities committee had deemed professional neutral back when I still believed my biggest problems were quarterly sales figures and Henderson's impossible deadlines. That's impossible. I haven't applied for any mortgage. I understand your confusion, Mr. Richardson. The application shows all your correct information. Social Security number, employment history, income verification, even your wife's name is listed as co-applicant. The property address is 1247 Sycamore Drive, Riverside. 1247 Sycamore Drive. I knew that address. I'd driven past it 3 months ago when my son Marcus dragged me through his perfect neighborhood for what I thought was just another one of his pipe dreams. 25 years old, working part-time at a gaming store, living in my basement, and somehow convinced he was ready to buy a house that cost more than I'd made in the last 8 years combined. Mr. Richardson, are you still there? Yeah, I'm here. My voice sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone who hadn't just discovered that his son had committed what was essentially identity theft on a scale that could destroy both their lives. Listen, I need to call you back, but first, can you freeze everything? Stop this from going through? I can place a fraud alert on your account, but given that the closing is tomorrow, you'll need to contact the lending institution directly. Do you have that information? I didn't, but I knew who did. The same person who'd apparently memorized my social security number, forged my signature, and somehow convinced a bank that his father was ready to co-sign for a mortgage that would eat up 60% of my take-home pay. I'll find it. I hung up and stared at Henderson through the glass wall of his office. He was checking his watch with the kind of theatrical impatience that reminded me why I'd spent the last 5 years updating my resume every 6 months, never quite finding the courage to actually send it anywhere. Today, Henderson and his quarterly projections seemed about as important as yesterday's weather forecast. My hands were shaking as I dialed Marcus's number. It went straight to voicemail, which meant either his phone was dead, likely, since responsibility had never been his strong suit, or he was avoiding me. Given what I'd just learned, the smart money was on avoidance. This is Marcus. You know what to do. Marcus, it's Dad. Call me back immediately. We need to talk about Sycamore Drive. I hung up and immediately called again, and again. By the 4th call, I was pacing the hallway like a caged animal, drawing stares from the accounting department. Sarah Martinez from Receivables actually stopped to ask if I was okay, which was when I realized I was talking to myself. Fine, Sarah, just fine. Just found out my son might have committed federal fraud, but hey, at least the quarterly numbers look good. She backed away slowly, the way people do when they realize they've accidentally engaged with someone who's having a complete breakdown in the workplace. I couldn't blame her. 6 months ago, I would have done the same thing. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in my Honda Accord in the parking lot, engine running, air conditioning blasting, trying to figure out how to drive home and confront my son without wrapping my car around a telephone pole. The rational part of my brain, the part that had survived 2 decades in middle management, was making lists. Call the mortgage company, contact a lawyer, check my credit report, figure out what other financial damage might be lurking. The father part of my brain, the part that had taught Marcus to ride a bike and helped him with algebra homework and watched him graduate high school with tears in my eyes, that part was just screaming. I'd raised him better than this, hadn't I? The drive home took forever and no time at all. Our house sat at the end of Maple Street in one of those subdivisions that had seemed like the American dream back in 2003 when Linda and I signed our own mortgage papers. Brick facade, two-car garage, enough yard for a dog we never got, and a garden Linda never planted. The kind of house that looked solid until you realized how easily it could all disappear. Marcus's car, the 2018 Honda Civic I'd co-signed for because he'd promised to make the payments himself, was in the driveway. I sat in my own car for 5 minutes, watching the house where I'd lived for 20 years, trying to prepare for a conversation I'd never imagined having. The side door led directly to the basement, which Marcus had gradually transformed into what he generously called an apartment. Linda had protested initially, worried that we were enabling him, but I'd argued that plenty of young men lived with their parents while they figured out their next step. What I hadn't anticipated was that his next step would involve stealing my identity. I could hear the rapid clicking of his mechanical keyboard as I descended the carpeted stairs. Marcus was hunched over his gaming setup, 3 monitors, LED lighting, a chair that had cost more than my first car, all purchased, he'd claimed, with money saved from his job at GameStop. "We need to talk." He spun around, and I saw my own eyes looking back at me. Same dark brown, same tendency to squint when concentrating. But where I'd learned to hide my emotions behind 2 decades of corporate diplomacy, Marcus wore everything on his face. Right now, what he wore was guilt. "Dad, I can explain." "You can explain how you stole my identity and bought a house without telling me?" His shoulders sagged. "It's not stealing if I was always planning to tell you." "When? At the closing? After you'd legally obligated me to a mortgage I can't afford?" "You can afford it. I did the math. Your salary plus mine." "Your salary?" I was shouting now, something I'd managed not to do since he was 16 and crashed the car into Mrs. Patterson's mailbox. "You make $12 an hour working 20 hours a week at a video game store. That's not a salary, Marcus. That's spending money." "I'm getting promoted. Jake said he's recommending me for assistant manager." "Jake said?" Jesus Christ, Marcus. Jake can't even show up to work on time. You think he's running the promotion committee? Marcus stood up, and I was reminded that sometime in the last few years he'd grown taller than me. When had that happened? "You don't believe in me. You never have." "I don't believe in fraud, son. There's a difference, son." "I was going to tell you. I just needed to get everything set up first. Show you it could work." "Show me what could work? How were you planning to make mortgage payments on a $340,000 house? Where did you think the down payment was going to come from?" The silence stretched between us like a canyon. Upstairs, I could hear Linda moving around in the kitchen, probably starting dinner, completely unaware that our lives had just imploded. "I figured we'd work it out," Marcus said finally. "We'd work it out." I sat down on the couch that had been relegated to the basement when Linda redecorated the living room 3 years ago. "Marcus, do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand that this is identity theft? That you could go to jail?" "It's not identity theft if you're my dad." "Yes, it is. That's exactly what it is." He sat back down in his gaming chair, spinning it slightly back and forth the way he'd done as a child when he was nervous. I thought, if I could get the house, prove that I could handle it, maybe you'd see that I'm not just some loser living in your basement." "Is that what you think I think of you? Isn't it?" I opened my mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Because the truth was more complicated than either of us wanted to admit. I loved my son. I'd always loved him. But love and respect weren't the same thing. And somewhere along the way, I'd stopped respecting the choices he made. Or maybe I'd stopped respecting his ability to make good choices at all. Marcus, whether I think you're a loser or not, which I don't by the way, committing fraud isn't the way to prove your independence. Then what is? I've been applying for better jobs for 2 years. I've got a college degree. I'm trying, Dad. I'm really trying. His college degree. Liberal arts with a focus on media studies, which had cost us $80,000 and qualified him for exactly nothing as far as I could tell. But he had tried, in his way. The problem was that his way didn't seem to align with reality. Trying doesn't involve stealing your father's credit. I wasn't stealing it, I was using it. There's a difference. Explain that difference to the FBI. The color drained from his face. Are you going to call the police? The question hung in the air between us. Was I? Could I? Turn my own son in for identity theft? The rational part of my brain said yes. This was a serious crime with serious consequences, and enabling it would only make things worse. The father part of my brain said that calling the police would destroy any chance of maintaining a relationship with my son. I called the bank. They're going to freeze the loan. Relief flooded his face. So we can fix this? There is no we here, Marcus. You created this mess. You're going to have to figure out how to clean it up. But I can't afford a lawyer, and if they investigate, then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to commit a felony. I stood up, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the kind of bone-deep fatigue I usually associated with the worst days at work. But this was worse than any corporate crisis I'd ever faced, because this was my family. Dad, please, I know I screwed up, but I can't go to jail. You know I can't handle that. He was right. Marcus had always been sensitive, prone to anxiety attacks that left him gasping for breath in the middle of seemingly normal situations. The thought of him in jail, vulnerable and afraid, made my chest tighten. You should have thought about that. I know I should have, but I didn't, and now I need help. I turned toward the stairs, then stopped. Why the house, Marcus? Of all the stupid things you could have done, why that house? He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I wanted you to be proud of me. I wanted to show you that I could be the kind of son who owns a house and has his life together. I wanted you to look at me the way you look at other people's kids when they tell you about their jobs or their families. The words were like a knife to the chest, because he wasn't wrong. I did look at other people's children differently. When my colleague Jim talked about his daughter, the nurse, or when my neighbor Bob bragged about his son, the engineer, I felt a stab of something that might have been envy. Not because I didn't love Marcus, but because I wanted to feel proud when people asked about him. Son? I know it was stupid. I know it was wrong. But I didn't know how else to make you see me as an adult. I sat back down on the couch, suddenly feeling every one of my 52 years. Committing fraud doesn't make you an adult, Marcus. It makes you a criminal. So what do I do? That was the question, wasn't it? What did we do now? I could call the police, let the justice system sort it out, and probably never have a normal relationship with my son again. I could try to fix this quietly, protect him from the consequences of his actions, and risk enneedling him to make even worse choices in the future. Or I could find some middle ground that satisfied neither justice nor mercy, but might, if we were lucky, salvage what was left of our family. First, you're going to call the mortgage company and explain that there's been a mistake. You're going to take full responsibility and make sure they understand that I had nothing to do with this. What if they want to prosecute? Then you'll deal with that, like an adult. He nodded, looking younger than his 25 years. And then, Then we figure out what comes next. Upstairs, Linda called down that dinner was ready. The normalcy of it, the routine announcement that had marked the end of thousands of ordinary days, seemed surreal given the conversation we just had. "Are you going to tell Mom?" Marcus asked. I thought about Linda, who'd spent the last year dropping increasingly unsubtle hints that maybe it was time for Marcus to find his own place. She'd been patient, more patient than I probably would have been if the roles were reversed, but I'd sensed her frustration growing. This would devastate her. She has a right to know. She's going to hate me. She's not going to hate you. She's going to be disappointed and angry and scared, but she's not going to hate you. How can you be sure? I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in months. When had he gotten so thin? When had those lines appeared around his eyes? He looked like someone who'd been carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. Because she's your mother, and despite everything you've done, despite how monumentally you've screwed this up, you're still her son. That evening, after the worst family dinner in recent memory, I sat in my home office trying to calculate the damage. My credit score would take a hit from the fraud alert. There might be legal fees if the mortgage company decided to pursue charges. And there was the larger question of what to do about Marcus himself, how to help him without enabling him, how to show him consequences without destroying him. Linda had taken the news better than I'd expected and worse than I'd hoped. She'd cried, which I'd anticipated, but she'd also gotten angry in a way I hadn't seen since Marcus was a teenager, and her anger had been directed as much at me as at him. "How did we get here, Tom?" she asked after Marcus retreated to the basement. "How did we raise a son who thinks this is acceptable?" I didn't have an answer for her, partly because I'd been asking myself the same question. We'd done everything the parenting books recommended. We'd been involved but not overbearing, supportive but not enabling. We'd set boundaries and enforced consequences. We'd loved him unconditionally while trying to teach him. So where had we gone wrong? My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. The caller ID showed my brother Danny's name, and I almost didn't answer. Danny lived in Phoenix, worked in construction, and had raised 3 kids who were all productive members of society. The last thing I needed was his perspective on parenting. "Tom, Linda told me what happened." Of course she had. Linda and Danny's wife Karen talked every week, sharing family updates and gentle gossip. By tomorrow, the entire extended family would know that Marcus had committed identity theft. "It's handled," I said. "Is it?" "We're working on it." "Tom, you know I love that kid, but this is serious stuff. You can't just make this go away by throwing money at it." "I'm not throwing money at anything." "Good, because if you do, if you bail him out of this without real consequences, you're not helping him. You're just teaching him that he can screw up as badly as he wants and Dad will fix it." I'd been thinking the same thing, but hearing it from Danny made me defensive. "What would you do?" "I'd let him face the consequences, full stop. Maybe spending a night in jail would wake him up." "He's not your son." "No, he's not. But I've watched you enable this kid for years, Tom, and I've watched Linda worry herself sick about him. Maybe it's time for some tough love." After Danny hung up, I sat in the dark office for another hour, thinking about tough love and consequences and the difference between being a good father and being an easy father. Outside, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking and the distant sound of traffic on the main road. Normal sounds of normal life, the kind of life I'd thought we were living until this afternoon. Eventually, I walked downstairs to check on Marcus. He was still at his computer, but instead of gaming, he was researching criminal lawyers. "Find anyone good?" I asked. He turned around and I saw that he'd been crying. "Dad, I'm scared." "You should be." "I mean, really scared, like I can't breathe scared." I sat down beside him on the couch. "Tell me about the house." "Not the fraud part. Tell me about the house itself. Why that one?" He was quiet for a moment, then pulled up a real estate listing on one of his monitors. The house was beautiful. Spanish colonial style, 3 bedrooms, a small yard with mature trees. It looked like the kind of place where someone could build a life. "I've been driving past it for 6 months," he said. "Every time I go to work, I take the long way so I can see it." And I started imagining what it would be like to live there, to have people over, to cook dinner in that kitchen, to feel like I belonged somewhere that was mine. It's a nice house. I know, it was stupid. I know I can't afford it. But when I saw that it was going on the market, I couldn't let someone else buy it. I couldn't let that dream go. I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. There had been dreams in my life too, dreams that had seemed so close I could taste them before reality intervened. A promotion that went to someone else, a business idea that never got off the ground, a life that had somehow become smaller and more constrained than I'd planned. Dreams don't justify fraud, son. I know that. I really do know that. But I didn't know how else to make it happen. By working, by saving money, by building credit gradually and responsibly. That would take years. So, he didn't have an answer for that, and I realized that patience had never been one of Marcus's strengths. He wanted what he wanted, when he wanted it, and the idea of delayed gratification had never quite taken hold. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you call the mortgage company first thing in the morning. You explain what happened and take full responsibility. You cooperate with whatever investigation they want to conduct, and you accept whatever consequences come from that. And if they want to press charges, then you deal with that like a man." What if I can't? What if I'm not strong enough? I looked at my son, this man-child who'd somehow convinced himself that committing fraud was easier than getting a better job, and felt a mixture of love and frustration that was almost overwhelming. Then you'll learn to be stronger. Because that's what adults do, Marcus. They face the consequences of their choices and figure out how to move forward. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Henderson would be furious, but Henderson's anger seemed manageable compared to the chaos in my living room. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, a notepad, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, preparing to make the most difficult phone calls of his life. Linda hovered nearby, alternating between supportive mother and disciplinarian. She'd made breakfast that no one ate and offered advice that no one wanted. Her nervousness was palpable, filling the kitchen like smoke. "You don't have to admit to anything criminal," she said for the third time. "Just say there was a misunderstanding." "Linda," I caught her eye and shook my head. "He needs to tell the truth." "The truth could send him to prison." "Lying will definitely send him to prison." Marcus looked up from his notes. "I'm going to tell them exactly what happened. I'm going to take full responsibility, and I'm going to pray they don't prosecute." At 9 a.m. sharp, he dialed the number for Pacific Coast Mortgage. I listened to his half of the conversation from the living room, trying to gauge the reaction on the other end from Marcus's increasingly panicked responses. "Yes, sir, I understand." "No, sir, he had no knowledge." "Yes, sir, I realize this is fraud." "No, sir, I don't have an attorney yet." The call lasted 23 minutes. When Marcus hung up, his hands were shaking. "They're freezing everything, pending an investigation. They want to meet with me tomorrow morning, with their security department." Linda sat down beside him and took his hand. "What does that mean?" "It means they're taking this seriously," I said. "It means there will be consequences." The rest of the day passed in a strange, suspended animation. I tried to work from home, but every few minutes I'd find myself listening for sounds from the kitchen, watching for changes in Marcus's expression, wondering what our lives would look like a week from now. Around 3 o'clock, my phone rang. Janet Morales from First National again. "Mr. Richardson, I wanted to update you on the situation. Pacific Coast Mortgage has confirmed that you were not involved in the fraudulent application. The hold on your credit has been lifted, and there should be no negative impact on your credit score." "What about my son?" "That's between him and Pacific Coast, sir. But I will say that his cooperation is being noted. That evening, Marcus came upstairs carrying a box of his gaming equipment. "I'm selling this stuff," he said, "all of it. I need money for a lawyer." Linda started to protest. The equipment had been expensive, and selling it would eliminate his primary source of entertainment and social connection. But I held up a hand to stop her. "Good," I said. "That's a start." Toward what? Toward taking responsibility for your life. Over the next week, our house became the epicenter of a quiet crisis. Marcus met with lawyers, cooperated with investigators, and slowly began the process of untangling the legal mess he'd created. The mortgage company decided not to press criminal charges in exchange for his full cooperation, and a promise to seek counseling for what their security department generously termed poor decision-making patterns. But the real work was just beginning, because while the legal crisis would eventually resolve itself, the family crisis was more complex. How do you rebuild trust after something like this? How do you help your adult child learn responsibility without treating him like a child? How do you love someone while still holding them accountable? The answer, I was learning, was one difficult conversation at a time. "I've been thinking about what you said," Marcus told me one evening as we sat on the back deck watching the sunset over our suburban neighborhood. "About dreams not justifying fraud." And you're right. But I've also been thinking about why I felt like I needed to do something so drastic. I waited for him to continue, having learned over the past week that pushing him to talk usually made him shut down. "I think I've been waiting for someone to give me permission to be an adult. Like I've been waiting for you or mom or someone to say, 'Okay, Marcus, now you're ready to have a real job and a real life.' But that's not how it works, is it?" "No, son, it's not. You don't get to be an adult by proving you're ready. You get to be ready by being an adult." It was the most insightful thing I'd heard him say in years, and I felt a flicker of something that might have been pride. "So, what are you going to do with that insight?" "I don't know yet, but I'm going to figure it out, without committing any more felonies." I laughed despite myself. That's probably a good policy. "Dad? Yeah? I know you've been disappointed in me for a long time, and I know this whole thing just made it worse." I thought about denying it, but we'd moved past the point where gentle lies were helpful. "I haven't been disappointed in you, Marcus. I've been disappointed for you. There's a difference." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've watched you struggle to find your place in the world, and I've wanted to help, but I didn't know how. And maybe, somewhere along the way, I stopped believing you could figure it out on your own. Did I prove you right or prove you wrong?" It was a fair question, and I took my time considering the answer. "Neither," I said finally. "You proved that you're human. You make terrible decisions sometimes, but you also have the capacity to learn from them. That's more than a lot of people can say." 3 months later, Marcus moved out of our basement and into a small apartment across town. He'd found a job at a local tech company, entry-level but with real growth potential, and was splitting his time between work and community college classes in computer programming. The apartment was tiny, barely more than a studio, and his furniture consisted mainly of a mattress on the floor and a card table that doubled as desk and dining room. But it was his, paid for with money he'd earned himself. Linda cried the day we helped him move, though I wasn't sure if they were tears of pride or worry. Maybe both. Watching your child take their first real steps toward independence is terrifying, even when those steps are long overdue. "It's not much," Marcus said as we carried the last box up the stairs. "It's enough," I told him. "It's yours." That night, Linda and I sat in our quiet house, listening to the sounds of suburban evening and trying to adjust to the absence of our son. After 25 years of parenting, the silence felt strange. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Linda asked. "I think he'll figure it out." "How can you be sure?" I thought about the question. About the son who'd nearly destroyed our financial lives in pursuit of a dream he couldn't afford, and the young man who'd spent the last 3 months systematically rebuilding his life from the ground up, because he finally understands that nobody's going to save him but himself. Is that good parenting or bad parenting? I don't know, but it's the truth. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two people who'd navigated 27 years of marriage and a quarter-century of parenting, and were finally learning to be just a couple again. Tom? Yeah? When he called today to thank us for helping him move, did you hear how his voice sounded different? I had noticed. There was something steadier about the way Marcus spoke now, something more grounded. The anxious edge that had characterized most of his conversations for the past few years was gone, replaced by something that sounded like quiet confidence. "He sounds like a man," I said. "Took him long enough. Better late than never." The phone rang, interrupting our conversation. I almost didn't answer. It was past 9 o'clock, and most calls at that hour brought bad news. But the caller ID showed Marcus's number. "Hey, Dad, I just wanted to let you know I'm all settled in." "Good. How does it feel?" "Scary, but good scary, you know? Like, I'm scared because this matters." I did know. I remembered that feeling from my own first apartment, the mixture of terror and exhilaration that came with being truly responsible for your own life. "That's normal, son." "Dad? Yeah? Thanks for not bailing me out. I mean, thanks for helping me clean up the mess, but thanks for not making it go away." "You're welcome. I love you. I love you too." After I hung up, Linda smiled at me with an expression I hadn't seen in months. "What?" I asked. "You did good, Dad." "We did. Yeah, we did." That night, I lay in bed thinking about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. 6 months ago, if someone had told me that my son would commit identity theft and it would somehow improve our relationship, I would have suggested they seek professional help. But here we were. The crisis had forced all of us to confront truths we'd been avoiding. Marcus had to face the fact that wanting something didn't entitle him to it, and that real independence required real responsibility. Linda had to accept that protecting our son from consequences wasn't actually protecting him at all. And I had to acknowledge that my disappointment in Marcus's choices had somehow become disappointment in Marcus himself. None of it had been easy. All of it had been necessary. I thought about the house on Sycamore Drive, the beautiful Spanish colonial that had started this whole mess. Someone else was living there now, probably building the kind of life Marcus had imagined for himself. Maybe someday, when he'd earned it, he'd find a house of his own. Or maybe he'd discover that the house had never really been the point. Maybe what he'd been looking for wasn't a place to live, but a way to feel like the kind of person who deserved to live there. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to steal his way into adulthood, Marcus had finally learned what it actually meant to be an adult. Sometimes the longest way around was the shortest way home. 6 months after the crisis, I got a call from Henderson at work. He'd been promoted to regional director and wanted to recommend me for his old position. It would mean more money, more responsibility, and the kind of recognition I'd been waiting for since I'd started at Hartwell Manufacturing. 2 years ago, I would have said yes immediately. But as I sat in my office, looking out at the parking lot where I'd received the phone call that changed everything, I found myself thinking about choices and consequences and the difference between what we want and what we need. "I appreciate the offer," I told Henderson. "Can I have some time to think about it?" "Sure, but don't take too long. This kind of opportunity doesn't come around often." That evening, I talked it over with Linda. The promotion would be good for us financially. It would validate 2 decades of steady work and corporate loyalty. But it would also mean longer hours, more travel, and less time for the things that actually mattered. "What do you want to do?" Linda asked. "I want to figure out what I want to do." It was the same answer Marcus might have given a year ago, but coming from me, it felt different, like a choice rather than an excuse. I called Marcus that weekend to tell him about the promotion offer. "Are you going to take it?" he asked. "I don't know. What do you think I should do?" "I think you should do whatever makes you proud of yourself." It was good advice, the kind of advice that showed real wisdom rather than just good intentions. "When did you get so smart?" I asked. "I had a good teacher." "Your mother?" "Both of you. You taught me that doing the right thing isn't always the easy thing, and that sometimes the easy thing isn't actually easy at all." 3 weeks later, I declined the promotion and applied for a job at a smaller company across town. It paid less money, but offered more flexibility and the chance to work on projects that actually interested me. When I got the job, Linda said I seemed happier than I'd been in years. She was right. Somewhere in the process of helping Marcus learn to make better choices, I'd started questioning my own choices. Not all of them were wrong, but not all of them were right either. Marcus came over for dinner the following Sunday, bringing his girlfriend Amy, whom we'd been hearing about for months but hadn't met. She was smart and funny and seemed to genuinely care about him, which was all Linda and I really wanted. After dinner, as we sat around the table talking about work and school and plans for the future, I watched my son interact with his girlfriend and realized something had fundamentally shifted. He wasn't performing adulthood anymore. He was just being an adult. "Amy's thinking about going back to school for her teaching degree," Marcus said. "I told her I'd help however I could." "That's wonderful," Linda said. "Teaching is such important work." "It doesn't pay very well," Amy said, looking embarrassed. "The best things usually don't," I said, thinking about my own recent career decisions. Later, as they were getting ready to leave, Marcus pulled me aside. "Dad, I've been wanting to ask you something." "Shoot." "Do you ever regret not turning me in for the identity theft thing?" It was a question I'd asked myself many times over the past year. "No," I said. "I don't regret giving you the chance to make it right." "Even though I didn't really face consequences?" "You faced consequences. They just weren't legal consequences." "What do you mean?" "You lost your illusions about easy solutions. You learned that actions have impacts beyond yourself. You discovered that the people who love you won't always protect you from your mistakes. Those are pretty significant consequences." He nodded slowly. "I used to think you didn't believe in me. I used to think you didn't believe in yourself." We were both right, weren't we? For a while, but not anymore. As I watched Marcus and Amy drive away, I thought about the strange math of family relationships. How disappointment could coexist with love. How crisis could lead to connection. How the worst mistake could become the foundation for the best growth. There was no moment when everything suddenly became perfect. No dramatic reconciliation or tearful apology that magically fixed years of accumulated frustration and misunderstanding. Instead, there was just the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust and learning to see each other as we actually were, rather than as we wished we were. It wasn't the story I'd imagined when Marcus was born 26 years ago. It wasn't the smooth trajectory from childhood to successful adulthood that all parents hope for. But it was real, and it was ours, and it was enough. The house on Sycamore Drive was still there, still beautiful, still occupied by someone else. Sometimes I drove past it when I was in that part of town, and I no longer felt the sting of what might have been. Instead, I felt grateful for what actually was, a son who'd learned that shortcuts often lead to longer journeys, and a family that had discovered how to love each other through the worst of times. A year later, Marcus called me with news that he'd been promoted to senior developer at his company. The pay raise would finally allow him to start saving for a house down payment, the legitimate way this time. "There's a place I want to show you," he said over the phone. "It's not as fancy as the Sycamore house, but it's in my price range, and it has good bones." Good bones was something my father used to say about houses, and hearing Marcus use the phrase made me smile. Maybe wisdom really did skip a generation, taking the long way around to find its mark. The house he showed us the following weekend was a modest two-bedroom craftsman in an older neighborhood. It needed work, new paint, updated appliances, some landscaping, but it had character and possibility. "What do you think?" Marcus asked, as we stood in the small backyard, imagining what it could become. I think it's perfect for someone who's willing to put in the work. I am willing. I know you are. As we walked through the house again, Marcus pointing out the features he loved and the improvements he planned to make, I realized that this was the conversation I'd been waiting years to have. Not a son asking his father to solve his problems, but a man sharing his plans with someone whose opinion he valued. "Dad," Marcus said, as we stood in what would be his living room, "I know I put you and Mom through hell with the whole identity theft thing. You did. And I know it took me way too long to figure out how to be responsible for myself. It did. But I want you to know that I learned something important from all of it. What's that? I learned that the only person who can make me proud of myself is me, and the only way to earn other people's respect is to deserve it." I looked at my son, this man who'd once thought he could steal his way to adulthood and now understood that everything worth having had to be earned, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not just love, which had never been in question, but genuine admiration. "I'm proud of you, son, for buying a house, for becoming the kind of man who can buy a house. There's a difference." 6 months later, I stood in Marcus's new kitchen, helping him install cabinet hardware while Linda and Amy painted the guest bedroom. It was the kind of ordinary family moment that I'd once taken for granted and now treasured. "Hand me that level," Marcus said, focused on getting the alignment perfect. As I watched him work, methodical, patient, taking the time to do things right, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. The crisis that had nearly destroyed our relationship had ultimately saved it, forcing us to confront hard truths and rebuild on a foundation of honesty rather than hope. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled. "What is it?" I asked. "Jake from GameStop. He's asking for advice about applying to college. Apparently, watching me turn my life around inspired him to think about his own future." "What are you going to tell him?" "That it's never too late to start making better choices, and that the first step is admitting you need to change." That evening, as Linda and I drove home from Marcus's house, we talked about how different our lives looked now compared to 2 years ago. The crisis had been devastating at the time, but it had also been clarifying. Sometimes you had to almost lose something to understand its true value. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he'd actually gone through with buying that house?" Linda asked. "Sometimes, but I think he would have learned the same lessons eventually. Maybe the hard way is the only way for some people." "Including you? What do you mean?" "I mean, you learned some things too, about what kind of father you wanted to be, about what kind of life you wanted to live." She was right. Watching Marcus struggle to find his way had forced me to examine my own path. The promotion I'd turned down, the job I'd taken instead, the choice to prioritize family time over career advancement, none of that would have happened without the wake-up call of our crisis. "Maybe we all needed to grow up a little," I said. "Better late than never." That seems to be our family motto. The following Christmas, our house was full for the first time in years. Marcus and Amy were there, of course, along with Danny and Karen, who'd driven in from Phoenix. My mother, now 83 and still dispensing unsolicited advice, held court from her chair by the fireplace. As I watched everyone gathered around our dining room table, laughing and arguing and sharing stories, I felt a deep sense of contentment that had nothing to do with external achievements and everything to do with the people we'd chosen to become. "Tom," my mother said after dinner, pulling me aside, "that boy of yours has really turned himself around." "Yes, he has. You and Linda did good work there. We did our best. Sometimes your best includes letting them fail." Coming from my mother, who'd spent 30 years protecting me from every possible disappointment, this was a profound acknowledgement. "When did you get so wise?" I asked. "About the same time you got brave enough to let your son learn from his mistakes instead of trying to prevent them." Late that night, after everyone had gone home or settled into guest rooms, I sat in my office reviewing the year that was. It had been a good year, not perfect, but good. Marcus was thriving in his new house and his career. Linda had started volunteering at the Community Literacy Center, finding fulfillment in work that mattered to her. And I'd discovered that taking a step back professionally had actually moved me forward personally. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Thanks for today. Thanks for everything. Love you, Dad." I typed back, "Love you too, son. Proud of the man you've become." It was a simple exchange, the kind of communication that passed between fathers and sons thousands of times every day across the country. But for us, it represented something hard-won and precious, a relationship rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and honest affection. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I thought about the house on Sycamore Drive one last time. Someone else was living there now, probably building their own version of the American dream. I hoped they'd found happiness there, and I hoped they'd earned it honestly. But more than that, I was grateful that Marcus hadn't gotten that house. Not because he didn't deserve nice things, but because getting it the way he'd planned would have robbed him of the satisfaction of earning it himself. The journey mattered as much as the destination, maybe more. In the end, the crisis that had nearly destroyed our family had actually saved it. Not through dramatic gestures or perfect solutions, but through the slow, patient work of learning to see each other clearly and love each other anyway. It wasn't the story I'd imagined when I first became a father, but it was the story we'd written together, and it was ours. The American dream, I'd learned, wasn't really about houses or careers or financial success. It was about the freedom to make mistakes and the opportunity to learn from them. It was about the possibility of second chances and the courage to take them. And most of all, it was about the faith that people could change, that families could heal, and that love could survive even the worst of human failings. As I climbed the stairs to join Linda in our bedroom, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The quiet satisfaction of a man who'd faced his greatest fear and discovered that on the other side of crisis lay not catastrophe, but connection. We'd all grown up that year, parents and child alike, and while it hadn't been easy, it had been worth it. In the morning, there would be new challenges, new opportunities to make good choices or bad ones. But tonight, I was content to rest in the knowledge that our family had survived its darkest hour and emerged stronger, wiser, and more honest than before. Sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in the worst packages. Sometimes the most important lessons arrive disguised as disasters. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to let the people you love face the consequences of their choices, you discover that love itself is more resilient than you ever dared to hope. The house on Sycamore Drive was just a house, but the family that had almost been destroyed trying to buy it, that was something worth more than any mortgage could ever measure.